In the middle of a howling gale, a loyal German shepherd suddenly stopped dead, defying the commands of its veteran owner. It barked fiercely toward an ancient oak tree, its eyes locked on the damp darkness. Trusting his companion's instinct, the man moved closer. Under a jagged flash of lightning, he was horrified to realize what his dog had found. It was not a wild animal, but a young woman, unconscious and pregnant. Her life, and the life of her unborn child, was now a matter of minutes. One wrong decision, and the storm could claim them both. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Where in the world are you listening from? The Appalachian foothills of North Carolina held their breath in the humid summer twilight. Here, tucked away in a small clearing miles from any paved road, stood the quiet cabin that Silas called home. It was his fortress against a world that had become too loud, a sanctuary built of rough-hewn logs and silence. Silas, a man in his early 40s, moved with the quiet economy of a predator who now sought only peace. His tall frame was lean but solid, a remnant of a life in the Marine Corps that felt a lifetime away. Short brown hair was dusted with silver at the temples, and his kind face was etched with lines that spoke more of sleepless nights than of laughter. The ghosts of Fallujah still visited him in his dreams, and his only shield against them was the profound stillness of the forest. His only companion in this self-imposed exile was Kodiak, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose magnificent coat of silver, gray, and white made him seem like a spirit of the woods himself. Kodiak was also a veteran of a different kind, rescued from a brutal training facility where his spirit had been nearly broken. Silas had given the dog a home, and in return, Kodiak had given Silas a reason to face the dawn. The dog understood the tremors that sometimes ran through Silas's hands, the far-off look in his eyes. In those moments, Kodiak would rest his heavy head on Silas's knee, a silent, grounding presence that said more than words ever could. Their bond was forged in a shared understanding of survival, a quiet pact between two souls who had seen the harsher side of life and found their peace in each other. Tonight, however, peace was in short supply. The sky, which had been a placid canvas of purple and orange, had turned a bruised and angry black. The wind began to moan through the pines, and the first fat drops of rain struck the tin roof like scattered buckshot. Soon, it was a deluge. Rain fell in blinding sheets, and lightning tore across the sky, followed by claps of thunder so violent they seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Silas stood by the window, watching the woods disappear into a churning wall of water. He was about to turn away when Kodiak, who had been dozing by the hearth, shot to his feet. His body went rigid, his ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Silas went to the door, peering into the chaos. "Easy, boy, it's just the storm." But Kodiak ignored him. He ran to the door, whining, then back to Silas, his intelligent eyes filled with an urgent plea. Stepping onto the covered porch, Silas felt the spray of the wind-driven rain. Kodiak bounded down the steps and stopped, staring intently into the darkness toward a massive, ancient oak tree that stood at the edge of the clearing. He let out a sharp, commanding bark. Silas called his name, a low command that usually brought instant obedience. But not tonight. The dog barked again, a desperate sound that cut through the roar of the storm, refusing to move, his gaze locked on the base of the old tree. Trusting his dog more than his own senses, Silas grabbed a heavy flashlight and pulled on his boots. "All right, Cody, I'm coming," he shouted over the wind. "Show me!" Kodiak led the way, his powerful body pushing through the gale. The flashlight beam danced wildly, slicing through the rain. As they drew closer to the oak, Silas's heart began to pound in his chest. What could be out here in a storm like this? Then the beam fell upon it, a crumpled shape huddled against the massive trunk. It was a person. He broke into a run, Kodiak already there, circling the still form. It was a young woman, her clothes soaked through, her body curled into a tight ball. She was unconscious, her face pale and cold against the dark, wet bark. As Silas knelt, the beam of his light fell upon her rounded belly, and the terrible reality of the situation hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was pregnant. Without a second's hesitation, the soldier in him took over. He gently scooped her limp form into his arms and, with Kodiak at his heels, turned back toward the warm, life-saving light of his cabin. Silas worked with a practiced calm, his movements swift and efficient. He carefully removed the woman's soaked jacket and boots, his touch gentle and impersonal, before wrapping her in the warmest wool blankets he owned. He laid her on the thick sofa before the hearth, where the growing fire began to chase the chill from the room and cast flickering shadows on the log walls. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the relentless drumming of rain on the roof. Kodiak lay nearby, a silent, watchful statue of gray and white fur, his body positioned between the woman and the cabin door. Silas busied himself making broth, the simple task a way to focus his mind and push back the rising tide of questions. He was trained for crisis, but nothing had prepared him for this. Her eyes opened with a sudden, sharp gasp. They were a deep shade of brown, now wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the air from the room. She saw the unfamiliar ceiling, the rustic walls, and the large, shadowed figure of a man standing across the room. A choked sob escaped her lips, and she struggled to sit up, her body trembling violently as she tried to shrink away from him. Silas immediately raised his hands in a slow, placating gesture. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and steady. "You were outside in the storm. I brought you in." But his words were lost in her panic. It was Kodiak who broke the stalemate. The great dog rose silently and padded over to the sofa. He didn't bark or whine. He simply stopped beside her and rested his heavy, intelligent head on the cushion near her trembling hand. He blinked his dark, soulful eyes slowly, a gesture of profound peace. The woman froze, her terrified gaze shifting from Silas to the dog. Hesitantly, she lifted a hand and let her fingers sink into the thick fur of his neck. The dog didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch, letting out a soft, low sigh. The tension in her shoulders eased, and the frantic terror in her eyes softened into a weary, fragile watchfulness. The quiet compassion of the animal had reached her where human words could not. After she had taken a few sips of the warm broth, she finally spoke, her voice a raw whisper. "I'm running away," she said, her eyes darting towards the rain-streaked windows. "From my boyfriend. His name is Vince." She clutched the blanket tighter. "Please," she begged, and now tears streamed freely down her pale cheeks. "Please don't call the police. Don't tell anyone I'm here. He'll find me. I know he will." Silas simply nodded, his expression giving nothing away. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of the hunted, and he would not betray her trust. Later, when a fitful, exhausted sleep had finally claimed her, Silas stepped onto the porch and quietly pulled out his phone. He didn't call the main precinct line. He dialed a direct number he knew by heart. The voice that answered was gruff, but familiar. Brody. It was Sheriff Brody, a stout, no-nonsense man who had known Silas for years. "Silas," he began, keeping his voice low. "I need you to do something for me, off the books. Run a name. Vince. Don't know the last name. Might have a record." There was a pause, then the sound of typing. "Got a Vince Riley with a sheet for assault," Brody's voice crackled back. "Violated his probation 2 weeks ago. He's a nasty piece of work, Silas. Why are you asking?" Silas looked back through the window at the sleeping woman, Kodiak still a faithful sentinel at her side. "Just a gut feeling, Brody. Thanks." He ended the call, the weight of the sheriff's words settling heavily in his chest. This was far more dangerous than he thought. He wasn't just sheltering a runaway. He was harboring the target of a violent, documented criminal. The morning brought a world washed clean. The rain had stopped, leaving the air smelling of damp earth and pine, but the fragile calm did little to ease the tension inside the cabin. Alara sat huddled in a large armchair, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. She looked small and lost in the borrowed clothes Silas had given her, but a flicker of resolve had replaced the sheer terror in her eyes. Silas moved about the small kitchen, his quiet presence filling the space without crowding it. He didn't press her for information, instead allowing the silence to be a balm. It was a strategy he had learned in the deep woods. Sometimes the most effective action is stillness. A call from Sheriff Brody late that morning shifted the dynamic. "Got something for you, Silas," the sheriff's gruff voice said over the line. "My most reliable neighborhood watch is an 80-year-old woman named Martha Jenkins who lives down the road from you. Spends her days watching birds, but she sees a whole lot more. She called in this morning, said a beat-up rusty pickup truck was parked on the service road for half the day a couple of days back. She thought it was odd, so she wrote down the license plate. It's registered to one Vince Riley." The threat now had a shape and a name. He was not just a ghost from Alara's past. He had been here, scouting, waiting. Silas thanked his friend and hung up, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, Kodiak's demeanor changed. The calm, steady companion of the daytime vanished, replaced by a vigilant sentinel. He would not settle by the fire. Instead, he paced a silent, deliberate path from the front door to the window near where Ilara rested. Every few minutes he would stop, his head cocked, his body rigid as he listened to sounds only he could hear in the deepening gloom. A low growl would occasionally vibrate in his chest, a sound so faint it was more felt than heard. Silas watched him, his own senses on high alert. This wasn't restlessness. This was a warning. Kodiak sensed a presence in the darkness, a predator circling just beyond the light of the cabin. The danger was no longer a phone call away. It was right outside. The dog's unwavering vigilance seemed to give Ilara a strange sort of courage. She watched him, this magnificent animal who had appointed himself her guardian. "He knows," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas looked at her. "He senses things," he replied simply. She took a deep breath, and the rest of the story poured out of her. She spoke of Vince's suffocating control, his explosive temper that could be triggered by the smallest thing. The final straw, she explained, was his demand that she help him. He needed to transport a package, something illegal and dangerous, and wanted her to drive the car because no one would suspect a pregnant woman. When she refused, he had locked her in their apartment, telling her she had no choice. She had escaped through a bathroom window in the dead of night and had been running ever since. When she finished, the only sound was the gentle thud of Kodiak's tail against the wooden floor as he laid his head in her lap. Silas looked at the young woman, her face streaked with fresh tears, and then at the loyal dog, offering silent comfort. He now understood the full, desperate weight of her flight. This was not a lover's quarrel. This was a matter of life and death, and he and his faithful companion were standing squarely in the middle of it. The outside world began to close in. Sheriff Brody called again the next afternoon, his voice tight with frustration. "He's here, Silas. In town. Vince Riley walked right into the general store an hour ago. Didn't buy a thing. Just stood there, staring at everyone." He paused. He asked Peggy, the girl at the counter, if she'd seen a pretty, pregnant girl who might have passed through. Said she was his wife and he was worried sick. Peggy was terrified. "The man radiates menace. The whole town is on edge. He's not hiding anymore, he's hunting." The news fell like a stone in the quiet cabin, sending ripples of fear through the air. Vince was no longer a ghost on the back roads. He was a physical presence, brazen and bold, and he was drawing the circle tighter around them. Any thought Silas had of moving Ilara vanished with that call. Transporting her now, in her advanced state of pregnancy, would be suicide. They would be exposed, vulnerable on the open road. Here, in his isolated cabin, he knew the terrain. He controlled the approaches. This was his ground. "We're staying here," he told Ilara, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This is the safest place for you now." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. She trusted him. She trusted the quiet competence that now animated his every move. The soldier had taken over. He spent the rest of the day fortifying their small sanctuary, checking every lock, securing the shutters, and boarding up a small window in the back that he deemed a weak point. He was turning his home into a fortress, his actions deliberate and precise. While Silas prepared their physical defense, Kodiak tended to Alara's emotional state. The bond between them had deepened into something profound and unspoken. The great dog seemed to understand that his primary duty now was not to scout the perimeter, but to be her anchor in a sea of fear. He did not leave her side for a moment. As she sat by the window, her hand resting on her swollen belly, Kodiak would lay his head on her lap, his warm, steady breathing a comforting rhythm against the frantic beating of her own heart. She would talk to him in low whispers, telling him about her hopes for the baby, her fears of Vince, pouring out her heart to the silent, furry confessor. His presence was a constant, calming reassurance, a living wall of loyalty that gave her the strength she needed to endure the terrifying weight. As night fell, a new quiet settled over the cabin. It was not the peaceful silence of sanctuary, but the tense, charged silence of a garrison, awaiting an inevitable assault. Silas sat in a chair facing the door, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, scanning the darkness outside. Alara rested on the sofa, one hand always touching Kodiak's thick coat. The dog lay at her feet, awake and watchful, a low growl occasionally rumbling deep in his chest. They were a small, unlikely unit bound by circumstance. The weary soldier, the hunted mother, and the faithful guardian. The noose had tightened, and they were ready, waiting for it to finally pull taut. The sky broke. Just as the day before, the heavens opened up, but this storm was different. It was faster, more violent, as if the sky itself were possessed by a furious energy. The wind shrieked and thunder cracked overhead like a celestial whip. As the first blast of thunder shook the cabin, Alara cried out, a sharp, piercing sound that had nothing to do with fear. She arched her back on the sofa, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "It's time," she gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "The baby. It's coming now." At that exact moment, a pair of headlights cut through the maelstrom, their beams sweeping across the cabin windows. The sickening crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the rusty pickup truck. Vince was here. Silas felt a strange, cold calm descend over him. The chaos outside and the crisis inside merged into a single point of focus. "Alara, listen to me," he said, his voice firm and clear. "Lock the door behind me. Stay away from the windows. Call Brody. Tell him Vince is here." She nodded, her breath coming in ragged pants. Silas took one last look at her, then turned and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. Vince was getting out of his truck, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. He was a big man, running to fat, but with the heavy shoulders of a brawler. "I knew I'd find you," he sneered, his voice nearly lost in the wind, hiding behind some old soldier. "Bring her out." Silas stood his ground, planting his feet. "She's not going anywhere with you, Vince. Get back in your truck and leave." He was buying time. He just needed to buy a few minutes. Vince laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You're in my way." He closed the distance with surprising speed. He didn't lead with a punch. He lunged, tackling Silas with the force of a runaway bull, driving him off the porch and into the mud and rain. The fight was brutal and one-sided. Silas was a trained fighter, but Vince was a wild animal, fueled by pure rage. He threw heavy, clumsy punches, and one caught Silas on the side of the head, sending a spray of rain and a burst of light across his vision. Silas stumbled, and Vince was on him, shoving him to the ground. He raised a fist, ready to bring it down with crushing force. In that split second, as Silas braced for the impact, the cabin door flew open. It wasn't the police. It was a silent gray and white blur of absolute fury. Kodiak launched himself through the rain without a sound. He struck Vince in the chest with the force of a battering ram, knocking the bigger man off his feet. Before Vince could even process what had happened, Kodiak's teeth clamped down hard on the arm that had been raised to strike Silas. A raw scream of pain and shock ripped from Vince's throat, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the storm. The dog didn't relent, using his weight and strength to pin the man to the sodden ground, a terrifying, low growl finally erupting from deep within his chest. Just then, the strobing red and blue lights of a police cruiser sliced through the trees, bathing the chaotic scene in an eerie glow. As Sheriff Brody and his deputy swarmed the screaming, pinned man, a new sound cut through the roar of the storm and the wail of the sirens. It was a high, clear, and powerful cry, a sound of pure, unblemished life. From inside the cabin, through the violent rage of the heavens, a baby had just been born. The world outside the cabin was born anew, washed clean by the storm and silenced by the cool, pre-dawn air. Inside, the chaos had receded, leaving a profound and weary peace. Vince was gone, taken away in handcuffs to face a long list of serious charges, his reign of terror finally over. A paramedic had checked on Silas, taping up a cut on his temple, but the man barely registered the sting. His entire focus was inside the warm, firelit room. Hilara, exhausted but radiant, lay propped against a mound of pillows on the sofa. Cradled in her arms, wrapped in a soft wool blanket, was her newborn son. He was small and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and tiny, curled fists. She looked down at him, a love so fierce and pure in her eyes that it seemed to light up the entire cabin. She had decided on a name, one she whispered like a prayer. Leo. Kodiak, the fearsome guardian of the night before, was transformed. He lay on the floor beside the sofa, his massive head resting near Ilara's feet. His protective instincts were still fully engaged, but all ferocity was gone, replaced by a gentle, watchful curiosity. When the baby made a small noise, the dog's ears would twitch, and he would lift his head, his dark eyes soft and inquisitive. He seemed to understand that this tiny, fragile creature was now the center of their universe, the treasure he had helped save. He was no longer a guard dog, he was a nursery guardian, a silent, furry sentinel watching over new life. Word travels fast in a small town. Sheriff Brody, a man not known for gossip, had made a point to tell the story of what had happened in that isolated cabin. He spoke of Silas's quiet courage and of the incredible loyalty of his dog. Soon, the town responded not with intrusion, but with kindness. Over the next few days, offerings began to appear on Silas's porch. A hot casserole from Martha Jenkins, a bag of fresh vegetables from the owner of the general store, a large box filled with diapers, soft blankets, and tiny baby clothes left anonymously with a simple note that read, "Welcome to the world, little one." For Ilara, these gestures were overwhelming proof that she had found a safe harbor. For Silas, they were a bridge back to a world he had long kept at a distance. He had built this cabin to be a fortress against his memories, a place to be alone with his ghosts. But now, it was full of life. The sharp edges of his trauma began to soften, the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in his mind quieted by the soft sounds of a baby's breathing. He found himself watching them, Ilara and Leo, and feeling a sense of purpose he thought had been buried forever in the sands of a foreign war. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was a protector, a guardian, a part of something that was growing and healing. Weeks later, the cabin was no longer a fortress, but a home. Silas would sit by the fire, watching Ilara rock Leo gently to sleep. Kodiak would be stretched out on the hearth, his tail thumping a soft, contented rhythm against the floorboards. They were a strange and beautiful constellation, 4 souls thrown together by a storm, scarred but not broken. They were not a family born of blood, but one chosen by fate, stitched together by courage and mercy, and forever protected by the unwavering heart of a heroic dog. The storm had passed, and in its place, a quiet, peaceful dawn had finally begun. This story reminds us that family is not always about the blood we share, but about the shelter we offer one another in the storm. The quiet courage of a man, the unwavering loyalty of a dog, and the hope of a new life, can create a bond stronger than any hardship. If this story touched your heart, you can share it with someone who might need a reminder that heroes and hope exist in the quietest places. Let us know in the comments what part moved you the most. Your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel allows this circle of storytelling to continue. And the journey doesn't have to end. Another story is waiting for you now, just a click away on the screen.